The amber glow of Edison bulbs casts long shadows across the mahogany bar of the dialectic, a small intellectual haven tucked away in a narrow alley of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Outside, October rain taps against tall windows like impatient fingers, while inside the air holds the rich aroma of aged whiskey and worn leather books. It is the kind of place where time seems suspended, where conversations drift from mundane to profound without warning. Two men sit at opposite ends of the polished bar, each nursing a drink that mirrors their temperament. Arthur Schopenhauer, his wild white hair catching the light, swirls a glass of dark port with the methodical precision of someone who has spent decades contemplating life's bitter truths. His piercing blue eyes reflect a depth of melancholy that seems to pull at the very fabric of the room. Across from him, Albert Camus leans against the bar with casual defiance, a cigarette dangling from his lips, his dark hair slightly disheveled. Before him sits an untouched glass of absinthe, its green tint catching the light like a challenge to conventional wisdom. The bartender, a philosophy graduate student who recognizes the weight of this moment, quietly polishes glasses while pretending not to eavesdrop. The late hour has emptied the bar of its usual crowd, leaving only these two titans of thought and the electric tension that crackles between opposing worldviews. Schopenhauer takes a measured sip of his port and breaks the silence that has settled like fog between them. You know, Monsieur Camus, I have spent considerable time observing your generation's peculiar relationship with suffering. You seem to believe it can be overcome. His German accent carries the weight of certainty, each word deliberate and sharp. Camus exhales smoke slowly, his eyes never leaving Schopenhauer's face. And you, my friend, seem to believe suffering is the only truth worth knowing. Tell me, where has that gotten you? What wisdom have you extracted from your pessimism that makes it worth embracing the darkness? The older philosopher sets down his glass with the gentle precision of someone handling fragile truth. Suffering is not something we choose to embrace, young man. It chooses us. It is the fundamental condition of existence itself. The will to live drives us forward into an endless cycle of desire and disappointment. We want, we strive, we achieve momentarily, and then we want again. This is the pendulum between the pain of want and the boredom of satisfaction. But that is precisely where you are wrong, Camus interjects, leaning forward with the intensity of someone who has stared into the abyss and refused to blink. Suffering exists, yes. The absurdity of our condition is undeniable, but wisdom does not come from accepting this suffering as inevitable or meaningful. Wisdom comes from recognizing the absurdity and choosing to revolt against it. Schopenhauer's laugh is dry, like autumn leaves scraping against pavement. Revolt? Against what? Against the very nature of existence itself. You sound like a child shaking his fist at a thunderstorm. Perhaps, Camus says, stubbing out his cigarette with deliberate force. But at least this child refuses to bow down before the storm. You speak of suffering as if it were a teacher, as if pain somehow ennobles us or makes us wise. But I have seen enough suffering to know that it teaches us nothing except that we suffer. The question is not how to learn from it, but how to live fully despite it. The rain outside intensifies, drumming against the windows with increasing urgency. Inside, the two men seem to occupy different universes, despite sharing the same physical space. Schopenhauer represents the weight of European pessimism, the accumulated wisdom of someone who has seen through the illusions of hope and progress. Camus embodies the rebellious spirit of mid-20th century thought, the refusal to accept defeat even in the face of meaninglessness. You misunderstand the nature of wisdom, Schopenhauer continues, his voice taking on the tone of a professor addressing a particularly stubborn student. True wisdom is not about living fully, as you put it. True wisdom is about understanding that life itself is suffering, and that the only escape from this suffering is through the negation of the will to live. We suffer because we desire, and we desire because we fail to see through the veil of Maya, the illusion that makes us believe our individual existence matters. Camus signals to the bartender for another drink, his movements carrying a restless energy that contrasts sharply with Schopenhauer's measured composure. And yet here you are, still alive, still drinking port, still engaging with the world you claim to have seen through. If existence is truly suffering and wisdom lies in negating the will to live, why haven't you achieved this ultimate wisdom yourself? The question hangs in the air like smoke, challenging and direct. Schopenhauer's eyes narrow slightly, recognizing the philosophical trap being set for him. Outside, the storm seems to pause, as if even nature waits for his response. Schopenhauer regards the younger man with the patience of someone who has fielded such challenges countless times before. He adjusts his position on the bar stool, his movements deliberate and considered, like a chess master contemplating his next move. The bar's atmosphere seems to thicken around them, heavy with the weight of ideas that have shaped centuries of human thought. Your question reveals the very misunderstanding that plagues modern thinking, Schopenhauer begins, his voice carrying the authority of decades spent in philosophical contemplation. You assume that wisdom must be immediately transformative, that understanding suffering should somehow exempt us from experiencing it. But this is not how truth operates. A doctor who understands cancer does not become immune to it. A meteorologist who predicts storms is not spared from getting wet. He pauses to take another sip of port, allowing the analogy to settle between them like sediment in wine. I continue to exist because complete negation of the will is extraordinarily rare. It requires not just intellectual understanding, but a profound experiential recognition that penetrates to the very core of being. Most of us, myself included, achieve only partial liberation through aesthetic contemplation, through philosophy, through brief moments when the veil of illusion lifts. Camus leans back against the bar, his new drink untouched before him. The green of the absinthe catches the light differently now, more subdued, as if even the liquor responds to the gravity of their discussion. So, your wisdom is incomplete then. You offer a diagnosis without a cure, a philosophy that promises liberation but delivers only the knowledge of our imprisonment. Better to know the truth of our condition than to live in delusion, Schopenhauer responds firmly. The majority of humanity stumbles through life driven by blind will, chasing after phantoms of happiness and fulfillment. They marry believing it will complete them. They pursue wealth thinking it will satisfy them. They seek fame imagining it will validate them. All of these pursuits lead inevitably to disappointment because they are based on the fundamental error of believing that the will can be permanently satisfied. The bartender moves quietly in the background, arranging bottles with the careful attention of someone who understands that he is witnessing something significant. The storm outside continues its relentless percussion against the windows, creating a soundtrack of natural turmoil that mirrors the intellectual tempest brewing inside. But you see, Camus interjects, his voice gaining intensity, this is exactly where your philosophy becomes not wisdom, but a form of spiritual suicide. You describe suffering as if it were the only authentic human experience, as if joy, love, creation, and rebellion were somehow less real or less important. Yes, we suffer. Yes, existence can be absurd and meaningless, but why should that be the end of the story? Schopenhauer's eyes flash with the fire of genuine philosophical passion, because anything else is self-deception. Look around you, Monsieur Camus. Look at the world with honest eyes. Wars rage continuously across the globe. Millions starve while others feast. Disease and death claim young and old alike without discrimination. Even in the most prosperous societies, rates of depression and anxiety climb steadily. Where is this joy you speak of? Where is this fulfillment that supposedly makes existence worthwhile? It exists in the very act of rebellion against these conditions, Camus responds without hesitation. It exists in the moment when a person chooses to love, despite knowing that love can cause pain. It exists when someone creates art, knowing that their work may be forgotten. It exists when we choose solidarity with other human beings, even though we cannot save them from their ultimate fate. The conversation has taken on the rhythm of a verbal duel, each man parrying the other's philosophical thrusts with increasing skill and intensity. Schopenhauer represents the culmination of German idealism's pessimistic turn, while Camus embodies the existentialist revolt against nihilism that would define much of 20th century thought. You mistake rebellion for wisdom, Schopenhauer counters, his voice rising slightly for the first time. What you call revolt is simply another form of the will's endless striving. You rebel because you cannot accept the truth of our condition. You create meaning because you cannot bear meaninglessness. You choose solidarity because you cannot face solitude. These are not solutions to the problem of existence. They are symptoms of your refusal to see the problem clearly. Camus stands abruptly, his movement sharp and decisive. He walks to the window, pressing his palm against the cool glass as rain streaks down its surface. For a moment, he watches the water's chaotic path, seeming to find in its randomness a reflection of his own philosophical position. Perhaps, he says quietly, his back still turned to Schopenhauer. But if rebellion is a symptom, then I choose my symptoms carefully. I choose to be symptomatically human rather than wisely miserable. Camus remains at the window for several heartbeats, his silhouette framed against the storm-darkened glass. The reflection shows two faces, his own, intense and searching, and behind it, the ghostly outline of Schopenhauer still seated at the bar. When he finally turns back, there is something different in his demeanor, a quiet energy that suggests the conversation has moved into deeper territory. You know what I think your real mistake is, Arthur, Camus says, returning to his seat but remaining standing, his hands gripping the back of the bar stool. You have made suffering into a god. You worship at its altar and mistake your devotion for wisdom, but suffering deserves no such reverence. It simply is, like rain or wind or the color of these walls. Schopenhauer raises an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. I worship nothing. I merely recognize what others refuse to see. No, you do more than recognize, Camus presses, his voice gaining the passionate cadence of someone who has found his philosophical footing. You glorify suffering by making it the path to truth. You give it meaning by suggesting that those who suffer somehow understand existence better than those who do not. This is a form of spiritual aristocracy, a belief that pain ennobles us in ways that joy cannot. The bartender has stopped even pretending to work, openly listening now to a conversation that feels like watching intellectual lightning strike repeatedly in the same place. Outside, the storm seems to be reaching its peak, with thunder rolling across the Cambridge sky like the footsteps of giants. But here is what I have learned, Camus continues, finally taking his seat again but leaning forward with urgent intensity. Suffering teaches us only that we can suffer. It does not make us wise. It does not reveal hidden truths about existence. It does not connect us to some deeper reality. A man dying of cancer knows no more about the meaning of life than a man dancing at his wedding. The cancer patient simply knows more about cancer. Schopenhauer's port sits forgotten as he focuses entirely on Camus's words. Then what do you propose? That we simply ignore the reality of suffering? That we pretend existence is other than what it manifestly is? I propose that we refuse to let suffering define existence, Camus replies with firm conviction. Yes, life is absurd. Yes, we will all die. Yes, there may be no ultimate meaning or purpose to our presence here, but these facts do not diminish the reality of human experience. They do not make love less powerful, beauty less moving, or solidarity less important. He pauses to light another cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating his face with warm light before returning it to the amber shadows of the bar. I speak of the will to live as if it were a curse, something to be overcome or transcended. But what if the will to live is not the problem? What if the problem is our expectation that life should be something other than what it is? Now you sound like a Buddhist, Schopenhauer observes wryly. Attachment is suffering. Desire leads to disappointment. These are not original insights, young man. Perhaps not, Camus acknowledges with a slight smile, but my conclusion is exactly opposite to yours. Instead of seeking to escape desire and attachment, I suggest we embrace them fully while simultaneously accepting their ultimate futility. This is what I call living with the absurd rather than being crushed by it. The conversation has shifted into more nuanced territory now, moving beyond simple opposition toward a more complex exploration of how human beings might respond to existential challenges. Schopenhauer leans back in his chair, his expression thoughtful rather than combative. And what does this embrace look like in practice, he asks. How does one live fully while accepting futility? Like Sisyphus, Camus responds without hesitation, condemned to push his boulder up the mountain for eternity, knowing it will always roll back down. The absurd hero does not seek to escape his condition or to find some hidden meaning in his punishment. Instead, he chooses to find fulfillment in the struggle itself, in the very act of pushing the boulder. But why? Schopenhauer asks, genuine curiosity replacing his earlier skepticism. Why choose struggle when you could choose resignation? Why push the boulder when you know it is meaningless? Camus takes a long draw from his cigarette, letting the smoke curl slowly from his lips as he formulates his response. Because the choice to push is the only freedom we have, the boulder will always roll back down. This is the absurd condition we cannot change. But how we respond to this condition, whether we push with joy or despair, with rebellion or resignation, with solidarity or solitude, this choice remains ours. The rain against the windows has softened now, shifting from the urgent percussion of the storm's peak to the gentle, steady rhythm of lasting precipitation. Inside the bar, the two philosophers sit in a moment of contemplative quiet, each considering the other's position with the serious attention it deserves. You make rebellion sound almost optimistic, Schopenhauer observes carefully. But rebellion presupposes something to rebel against. If existence is truly absurd and meaningless, what exactly are you rebelling against? Against the temptation to despair, Camus replies quietly. Against the seductive logic that says because life has no inherent meaning, it is therefore not worth living. Against the philosophical pride that mistakes understanding suffering for wisdom itself. The storm outside has reached that peculiar moment of transition where intensity gives way to persistence. The rain no longer pounds against the windows, but falls with steady determination, as if it has settled in for the long duration. Inside the dialectic, the atmosphere has similarly shifted. The earlier tension between opposing worldviews has evolved into something more complex. Not agreement, but a form of mutual recognition that transcends simple philosophical combat. Schopenhauer sits quietly for several moments, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass in slow, concentric circles. When he finally speaks, his voice carries a different quality, less professorial and more personally reflective. You know, Monsieur Camus, there was a time in my youth when I might have found your position appealing. He pauses, seeming to weigh each word carefully. Before I fully understood the depths of human suffering, before I witnessed the systematic cruelty that life visits upon the innocent, I too believed that individual acts of defiance might somehow matter. Camus watches him intently, recognizing that they have moved into more vulnerable territory. And what changed your mind? What convinced you that wisdom lay in negation rather than affirmation? Experience, Schopenhauer replies simply. Watching my father's business failures drive him to despair, seeing my mother choose social success over genuine human connection, observing how every human achievement ultimately crumbles into dust, how every moment of happiness is inevitably followed by periods of suffering that outweigh it. The mathematics of existence, if you will, seem to demonstrate conclusively that the ledger always comes out negative. The bartender approaches quietly and refills Schopenhauer's glass without being asked, a gesture of respect for the gravity of the conversation unfolding before him. Camus nods his thanks when offered a refresh of his own drink, but waves it away. But perhaps, Camus suggests gently, the error lies not in your observations but in your accounting methods. You speak of mathematics, of ledgers, of suffering outweighing happiness, but human experience is not an equation to be balanced. It is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be lived. He stands again, but this time his movement is contemplative rather than restless. Yes, your father suffered business failures, but did he not also experience the joy of creation when he built something from nothing? Yes, your mother chose social success over authentic connection, but did she not also know moments of genuine laughter, of unexpected beauty, of connection, however fleeting? Schopenhauer considers this carefully. You suggest that I have been too focused on the negative aspects of existence. I suggest that you have made suffering more important than it actually is, Camus clarifies. Not more real, it is undeniably real, but more significant. You have given it explanatory power it does not possess. Suffering does not reveal the truth about existence any more than joy does. Both are simply experiences that conscious beings have. The conversation has taken on an almost intimate quality now, as if two warriors have laid down their weapons and begun to speak as fellow travelers rather than opponents. Outside, the rain continues its steady rhythm, no longer the soundtrack to conflict, but the background music of contemplation. But if suffering has no special significance, Schopenhauer asks, if it teaches us nothing about the fundamental nature of existence, then what prevents life from becoming merely trivial? Nothing, Camus admits with startling directness. Nothing prevents life from being trivial except our refusal to let it be so. This is precisely why the absurd requires courage. It would be easier to believe that suffering ennobles us, that pain has meaning, that our struggles serve some higher purpose. It would be easier to retreat into pessimism or to escape into false hopes. The difficult path is to acknowledge meaninglessness and create meaning anyway. Schopenhauer drains the last of his port and sets the glass down with finality. And you truly believe this is possible? To create meaning in a meaningless universe? I do not believe it, Camus responds with quiet conviction. I choose it. Every day, every moment, I choose to act as if my choices matter, even though I cannot prove they do. I choose solidarity with other human beings, even though I cannot save them. I choose to create, even though my creations will perish. I choose love, even though all love ends in separation. The two men sit in contemplative silence as the implications of their exchange settle between them like sediment in disturbed water. Neither has converted the other, but something has shifted in their understanding, not of their positions but of the human courage required to maintain any philosophical stance in the face of existential uncertainty. Perhaps, Schopenhauer says finally, the difference between us is not as great as it first appeared. You choose rebellion, I choose resignation. But both choices require a form of courage. Both acknowledge the fundamental challenges of existence. Both refuse easy answers. Camus nods slowly. Perhaps the real question is not whether suffering leads to wisdom, but whether wisdom leads to a life worth living. Your wisdom counsels detachment, mine counsels engagement. Both recognize the darkness, but they lead us in opposite directions. As the evening deepens around them and the storm outside begins its gradual retreat, the two philosophers sit with their respective truths intact, but somehow enriched by their encounter. In the end, neither suffering nor rebellion alone holds the answer to human existence, but the conversation itself, the willingness to engage seriously with fundamental questions, to challenge and be challenged, to think together about what it means to be human. Perhaps this is where wisdom actually resides. The bartender quietly begins closing preparations, and the two men prepare to return to their separate worlds, each carrying something of the other's vision within his own understanding. Outside, Cambridge sleeps under clearing skies, and somewhere in the distance, church bells mark the passage of another hour in humanity's ongoing conversation with itself.